Of the many aircraft to go missing over the years, most are small general aviation aircraft. This makes sense, as such aircraft would be harder to find than an airliner, not to mention the lesser profile such cases typically garner. Thus, when larger aircraft disappear, it becomes much harder to explain. Looking at the highest profile aircraft disappearances, many are airliners. There is one strange anomaly in this pattern. On July 18, 1970, a cargo plane disappeared while flying between Iceland and Nova Scotia. Other aircraft have disappeared during similar flights, even in the same region. What made this aircraft different was that it was the largest turboprop-powered aircraft ever built. 55 years later, it is unknown what caused the disappearance, and only a few pieces of wreckage were ever found. Despite this, only a small amount of often contradictory information is available. Today, we will look at what information does exist and explore this strange, obscure case. On May 31st, 1970, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake would rock the Ancash region of Peru. Numerous cities were damaged, and initially, only around 200 were suspected to have died. It was soon clear that this was not the case. Up to 70% of the buildings in the city of Chimbote were reported as being destroyed. Other cities, including Lima, the nation's capital, would see significant damage and loss of life. Overall, approximately half the country had seen some sort of damage from the earthquake. The hardest hit cities were Huaraz and Yungay. Nearly all of Huaraz was destroyed in the quake. Yungay was buried by a landslide alongside a few neighboring towns. It's estimated that 10,000 of 35,000 residents of Huaraz and 18,000 of 25,000 in Yungay had died in the quake. Overall, it's believed that 70,000 people were killed, making the 1970 Ancash earthquake one of the deadliest in history. Much of the nation's infrastructure was destroyed, while remote towns and villages could not be reached to confirm their status or rescue the injured. Given the isolation and general lack of access to many of the remote communities, it was soon recognized that a true death toll would likely never be known. By June 2nd, early rebuilding efforts were underway in cities like Chimbote. Given the level of destruction, however, it was clear that the people and government could not rebuild Peru on their own. Aid from the United States would begin to arrive on June 2nd when C-130s began landing in Peru. The U.S. ambassador to Peru would direct any U.S.-flagged vessels in the area carrying food to travel to Peru. Other nations in Latin America and Western Europe would send assistance, though the U.S. contribution would be the greatest by far. On June 28th, Pat Nixon, wife of President Richard Nixon, would arrive in Peru with supplies donated by regular Americans. She would tour the affected area and meet with survivors, as well as the nation's leader, Juan Velasco Alvarado. While this visit would garner significant attention in both Peru and the United States, it would prompt a response from the Cold War's other great power. One of the nations which appears to have been uninvolved in the Peruvian relief effort up to this point was the Soviet Union. Why this was the case is unclear. In early June, major flooding was occurring in Romania, possibly forcing the Soviets to direct aid there instead of Peru. This lack of aid was also noteworthy, as Lieutenant General Juan Velasco Alvarado, who had taken over the country via a coup in 1968, was strongly anti-American. He had nationalized the assets of a major American oil company upon his rise to power, and had refused to compensate them for the seizure of their property. His government had also seized and attacked U.S. fishing boats sailing in international water outside of Peruvian jurisdiction. Though Alvarado declared himself to be both anti-capitalist and anti-communist, his behavior and rhetoric clearly indicated a preference for the latter. Throughout the U.S. aid effort, Alvarado's government appears to have been quite ungrateful. Peruvian authorities would frequently come into conflict with the Americans. Peruvian media, meanwhile, accused the American aid effort of being insincere. The Peruvian government appears to have viewed the crisis in a rather ghoulish light, seeing it as a great opportunity to promote government programs and build support. As one official put it, quote, This will do more than anything else in the past to unite the Peruvian people behind the programs of their revolutionary government." End quote. Meanwhile, in the US, Nixon had been facing challenges from Congress on his foreign aid policy. By July 5th, Peruvian authorities had made little progress in cleaning up after the earthquake, and US aid efforts had effectively ended. Most US military assets participating in the relief effort had left the country by this point. This sudden aid vacuum, combined with the visit of Pat Nixon, appears to have finally attracted the attention of the Soviet Union. On July 3rd, the Peruvian government would announce an ambitious aid mission from the Soviet Union. 65 Soviet transport aircraft would make their way to Peru the following week, carrying supplies for a field hospital, 75 doctors, bulldozers, and helicopters. By July 6th, when the aircraft were supposed to arrive, more details would be provided. Soviet aid would also include food, medicine, and clothing. Supplies to make 100 houses would also be brought, as well as 25 geological engineers. The aircraft were scheduled to arrive in groups of 8, with intervals of 10 minutes between landings, making this the largest one-day air operation in Peruvian history. Just a day later, however, when the aid mission was supposed to have arrived, the Soviet ambassador to Peru would announce a delay. He was unaware or unwilling to disclose the cause of the delay or when the supplies would come. It would later be reported that the delay was caused by supply and fueling problems. The Soviet airlift would start again sometime prior to July 17th. They still intended to send 65 aircraft. Among their number were 4 Antonov AN-22s. The development of the AN-22 started in 1960. The prototype was completed in 1964 and made its first flight on February 27, 1965. The AN-22 had a wingspan of 64 meters and a length of 58 meters. The plane was powered by 4 Kuznetsov NK-12 turboprop engines, each producing 15,000 horsepower. The aircraft's cruising speed was 580 kilometers per hour. When it was completed, the AN-22 prototype was the largest turboprop aircraft ever built, a title it still holds to this day. The plane was designed to carry heavy cargo to remote or less developed areas in the Soviet Union. It could easily fit 3 dump trucks inside its cargo hold. Despite its massive size, the aircraft is capable of landing on unpaved runways. The impressive prototype would make its debut at the Paris Air Show. 66 AN-22s would be built in Tashkent between 1965 and 1976. The aircraft would serve a distinguished career, earning numerous world records related to speed and cargo capacity. Antonov would use the AN-22s to assist in the construction of other massive aircraft like the AN-140, AN-148, and AN-225. The aircraft would haul finished wing components from factories in places like Tashkent to Antonov's main facilities in Ukraine. Thus, the massive AN-22 was an appropriate choice for taking aid from the Soviet Union to Peru. The aircraft would fly from Moscow to Lima, but refueling stops would be needed to get there. It would appear that the plan was to make refueling stops in Keflavik and Halifax. The exact route is not known, and there appears to be disagreement as to where these stops were. While Keflavik appears to be agreed upon by all sources, the second stop is given as Sydney or Gander as well. The New York Times clearly indicates that the aircraft were landing at Halifax on July 17th, so this appears to be the most likely refueling point. There is a distance of around 6,500 kilometers between Halifax and Lima at absolute minimum. This is a rather long distance for a heavily laden cargo plane. A refueling stop somewhere in between is likely, possibly in Cuba, a friendly nation located near the route to Lima. By July 18th, one of the 4 AN-22s had arrived in Keflavik. Registered CCCP 09303, the aircraft was carrying 22 or 23 passengers and crew. Sources conflict on how many were on board the plane, as well as how many were passengers versus crew. No source provides any clear explanation of what cargo was on board the aircraft. The closest I can find to a cargo list is on this case's Wikipedia page, which claims the aircraft was carrying food. Most of this article is unsourced, however, and contradicts other sources, so the reliability of this claim is doubtful. After refueling was finished, the aircraft was set to depart for Halifax. When the plane departed Keflavik is disputed. The New York Times gives a departure time of 10 a.m. The aforementioned Wikipedia article says around 1:45 p.m., and the Bureau of Aircraft Accidents Archive says shortly after 4 p.m. The time given by the New York Times appears to be the most credible, as it was given within hours of the event by Major David Fry, a spokesman for the Canadian Armed Forces. What happened after takeoff and how the plane crashed is again disputed. All sources other than the New York Times say the aircraft flew for 47 minutes before disappearing from radar. All attempts to contact the aircraft failed, prompting a search shortly after. The New York Times has a different story. Sometime around 11 a.m., about an hour after takeoff, the turboprop made a routine position report. Another Soviet transport had departed sometime after the accident aircraft. The second plane arrived in Halifax at 4:50 p.m. After landing, the aircraft pilot noticed that the AN-22 hadn't arrived and had inquired about it with airport officials. Though not clearly stated, it appears as though this is when the aircraft was reported missing. Both narratives agree on one thing. As a spokesman for the North American Air Defense Command put it, quote, "We believe it has gone into the sea between Iceland and Newfoundland." End quote. Search efforts were brief on this day, only involving an American C-130 based out of Iceland and a rescue plane flying out of Nova Scotia. By the following day, the Danish Air Force had joined Canadian and American searchers looking for the Antonov. Soviet and Icelandic forces had apparently not joined the search by this time. Searches had been greatly hampered by the presence of low clouds, fog, and the thousands of icebergs scattered across the North Atlantic. Combined, these issues greatly reduced the effectiveness of the surface search radar being used aboard the aircraft. As suggested by the previous delay and disappearance, the Soviet relief effort was in shambles by this point. A Peruvian Air Force official had announced that only 12 of the 65 expected aircraft had arrived. 3 of these aircraft were AN-22s. I don't know if the remaining aircraft ever arrived in Peru. Back in the North Atlantic, an unknown number of U.S. Coast Guard vessels arrived in the search area to assist aircraft flying overhead. It would appear as though Iceland and the Soviets had still failed to join the search by this point. A brief but rather puzzling update would arrive for the story of the missing Antonov on the 21st. At least one American search plane heard a radio distress signal from the Antonov near the southern tip of Greenland. No further details are provided. This may have been some sort of automated distress signal. Why this signal wasn't heard previously is also not clear. I don't know what sort of emergency equipment was on board the AN-22, so I'm not sure what to make of this information. Perhaps aided by the distress signal, a U.S. Air Force C-130 would locate floating debris south of Greenland, believed to belong to the Antonov. It was reported that a ship would be sent to the area, presumably to collect some of the wreckage. By this point, the Soviets had finally joined the search, as an unknown number of Soviet reconnaissance planes would begin scouring the region for wreckage. No further updates would be given on the case for a month until the Soviet Union announced an end to search efforts. They would offer condolences to the families of those on board and thank the Western nations which assisted in the search. I was unable to find out if any wreckage was recovered. Certainly, the main wreckage was never found, nor was the cause of the crash. This case is the only time an AN-22 has disappeared, but it wouldn't be the only one to be lost in an accident. 9 AN-22s have been destroyed in accidents over the years, including the July 1970 disappearance. Of the 8 other crashes involving the type, 5 appear irrelevant to the case being discussed. The remaining 3 accidents may have some relevance, however. A few months after the disappearance, on December 19, 1970, the second fatal accident involving the AN-22 would occur. The aircraft in this case was flying between Dhaka, East Pakistan, and New Delhi. 40 minutes after takeoff, one of the propellers either detached or disintegrated. Significant damage was done to the aircraft, including the hydraulic systems controlling the landing gear and flaps. The crew were apparently able to make a distress call as they were directed towards Panagar. Emergency landing was attempted, but the plane became uncontrollable and crashed near the runway, killing all on board. The Wikipedia article for the July case claims that something similar was believed to have happened there as well. The article claims that the separation of a propeller blade caused an explosive decompression, which in turn caused the crash. It also claims that all AN-22s were grounded after the December accident. As previously mentioned, however, these claims are all unsourced. I could find no other confirmation of this claim. The fact that the propeller disintegration occurred around 40 minutes after takeoff is interesting, as some of the narratives on the July disappearance claim the plane went down after 47 minutes. Since these narratives are dubious, this may not mean much, however. The crash at Panagard does not fit the available evidence for the July disappearance. This aircraft was able to make a distress call prior to crashing and was able to stay in the air for some time. No distress call was received from the missing aircraft, suggesting a sudden crash. The distress signal that did come from the aircraft was only heard after the crash. On either the 6th or 8th of June 1980, an AN-22 was returning to Russia after a flight to Damascus. During the descent towards Moscow Sheremetyevo Airport, a fire broke out inside of a main gear well due to a mechanical failure. The crew attempted to divert to Moscow Vnukovo Airport. Main electrical power was quickly lost, while emergency power was lost during the approach to Vnukovo. Landing gear and flaps could not be put down. A belly landing was made in a field short of the airport. The aircraft would hit obstacles on the ground, killing 3 crew members. A sudden in-flight fire might explain the disappearance. The loss of all electrical power could explain why no distress call was received prior to the crash. However, it's not said how long it took for electrical power to be lost in the Moscow case. On December 28, 2010, an AN-22 completed a flight to Voronezh. The purpose of the flight was to deliver a MiG-31. Upon the completion of its mission, the aircraft departed for its home base at Tver. During the flight, the plane entered an uncontrolled descent and crashed into a field about 100 kilometers south of Tula, killing all 12 on board. A Russian government official suggested that the crash may have been caused by some sort of engine failure. The aircraft appears to have spent most of the 2000s out of service, sitting outdoors at Tver. The plane appeared to have become quite dilapidated during that time. Sometime between June of 2009 and June of 2010, the aircraft was restored and returned to service. On the day of the accident, an ice storm caused hundreds of flights to be cancelled at multiple airports in Moscow. Moscow is about 250 kilometers north of the crash site, suggesting a possible involvement of weather in the accident. I was unable to find out if any cause was ever determined. Either the case remains unsolved, or Russian authorities decided not to publicly announce their findings. There have been other cases in which AN-22s had been destroyed in a similar manner to the Peru-bound aircraft. Like the case discussed in this video, there is little information on these other occurrences. The lack of concrete information and contradicting narratives limits any analysis of this case. It wouldn't be the first time that such a disappearance occurred in the region. Earlier this year, I made a series of videos discussing one such case, this being the disappearance of Golf Alpha Hotel Foxtrot Alpha on February 2nd, 1953. Like this case, the aircraft suddenly vanished during a flight to Canada. The 1953 case has much more information available on it. The crew of this plane were able to send a partial distress call prior to the crash, but were unable to provide any detail on what caused it. No trace of the Avro York or its 39 occupants were ever found. In that video, I also discussed other cases which had occurred in the region. One of those cases is quite relevant to the 1970 disappearance. On September 11th, 1990, Oscar Bravo 1303 disappeared while flying between Keflavik and Gander. The Boeing 727-200 belonged to Fawcett, Peru, and was being brought home to Lima, after being leased to Air Malta during the busy European summer tourist season. A series of distress calls would be made by the aircraft indicating that it had gone off course and was running low on fuel. The crew were last heard from when they stated their intention to ditch the aircraft. No trace of the 727 or its 16 occupants were ever found. Though there are some similarities between these cases, they do little to indicate what happened to the AN-22. The ultimate issue is the lack of reliable information. No mention is made of the weather at the time of the disappearance. The cargo on board the aircraft is not listed. No report seems to be available. What evidence is present suggests that the aircraft met with some sort of sudden catastrophic issue while flying south of Greenland, which prevented any sort of distress call or emergency landing. The AN-22 has a history of serious mechanical failures that could cause such a crash, though they don't fit the known circumstances perfectly. When considering the New York Times narrative, it is notable that the wreckage found south of Greenland may indicate that the aircraft crashed prior to its next position report. Assuming that position reports were given hourly, this would indicate that the aircraft went down somewhere between these 2 points. This ultimately doesn't help much given the distance and the contesting narratives. Any conclusions that could be drawn from this case must be tempered by the complete lack of reliable information. I concede that I am not entirely confident that the entire narrative presented here is correct. For the aforementioned reasons, it's entirely possible that parts of the story have been missed or incorrectly presented. Based on what I was able to find, however, I believe this is the best summary of the events surrounding July 18th, 1970 that I am able to make. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm a bit unsatisfied that I was unable to find more information on the case. Perhaps I'll be able to find more information at a later date. I've made good progress on the new set of models. At the time of writing, 4 of 6 planned models are completed. I am currently in the process of 3D printing the models at the moment. 1 is already finished, but the remaining 3 are nearly finished. I'll be focusing on finishing the modeling for the final 2 aircraft, which is what I'll be doing when this video comes out. I need to get those finished to the point where I can make the decals for them, then I can start the painting and assembly process. I've still got a bunch of work to do, so for now, I have some models to make.